gone straight through the roof. But my mother is an immigrant from Northern Ireland. My father is an American. And from a young age, I was always aware of half of my family came from another country. And, when you're a kid growing up, you don't really think about your reality as being, different from others, I guess. But as I got older, I began to appreciate that, it is pretty rare to have a mother from Northern Ireland, especially when I was growing up. Northern Ireland was on the news all the time because of the car bombs going off. So I also had family in Montreal. So from a very young age, I got used to doing international travel. First time I went to Northern Ireland, I was 16. And my God, what a wake-up call that was for a kid from Minnesota to be in a police state like Northern Ireland. And suddenly the car bombs going off. I'm watching them on local television and realizing that they're just a few miles away that this happened. So that was an awakening for me with what political violence could be like. I went to college at St. John's University in central Minnesota. After I graduated, I moved to Chicago for 2 years, worked on my master's degree at DePaul University. And while I was there, I did something really on a lark, which changed the whole trajectory of my life. And that's one of the great things about living, I suppose, is you do these things and it's only in retrospect that you realize, wow, that changed everything. And what happened was I applied to become an Irish citizen because in the 1980s and 1990s, people were leaving Ireland in huge numbers. And Ireland wanted people to immigrate to Ireland. So they said that if you are the son or daughter of an Irish immigrant, you're automatically an Irish citizen. And I applied because I thought, well, it'd be kind of fun to get my Irish passport out at, parties or something and go, I'm an Irish citizen. But when I got the thing, I remember holding it and looking at it, and I realized that all of Europe is open to me. That because of the EU, I can live and work anywhere in Europe. And I thought, wow, that's an opportunity that I'd be stupid not to wrap both arms around. So I moved to Northern Ireland. I got another degree and I was at Queen's University Belfast while the Troubles were happening. Fell in love, moved to Germany, was in Germany for a year. And then I started my PhD in England. So I was in England for 3 years, met my wife in England, and we moved to Barcelona, Spain. And then I decided it was time to maybe get a career. So I decided I really wanted to move back to the United States. And my wife and I made up a list that said, pluses and minuses of living in the United States and the United Kingdom. And there were just more pluses in the column for the United States. So we moved back to the United States. I got a job at the University of St. Thomas for a year. And then Augustana had an opening and I came down and kind of fell in love with the place. And now the only way they'll get me out of this office is with a load of dynamite. I mean, I really love teaching here. So,
well, great, and we're glad to have you because I know that you've done a number of things that have increased the awareness of many things through the English department. If no other than the students that pass through your classes that I've had the occasion to run into from time to time. I want to talk now a little bit about your books. Yeah. Especially, I know you've done a number of poetry books, but today, since we're talking about the fiction, I'd like to sort of focus in on your books of fiction. Can you tell us kind of a thumbnail of each one of those?
Sure. I've always felt that I'm more of a fiction writer than a poet. I think as a poet, I've got some talent for it. But if you had to really say, choose one or the other, I'd always sort of feel more like I'm a fiction writer. So I started writing stories at a very young age, and I started then to publish short stories in my late 20s and early 30s. But it was always with the idea that I wanted to really write a novel. And I always saw the short stories as an apprenticeship where I would try to craft stories that would challenge me as a writer. So I'd choose a protagonist that was a woman, or I'd choose a protagonist that was African American, or I'd choose a protagonist that lived in a different part of the United States. And I felt that I really needed to be able to enter my characters who were not like me in order to write fiction. Because my job as a fiction writer is to make it believable that the world I've created exists when it only exists up here in the imagination. So I've always been drawn to studying and learning more about the Holocaust. So I realized that I really wanted my first novel to address that in some way, but I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do that. And then I was teaching a course here at Augustana, and in discussion with my students, they had heard of the camps that I would expect them to hear, I would say Dachau and Auschwitz. But when I asked them about other camps like Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, they hadn't heard of these places. And I thought, wow, these are young men and women that have had really extraordinary high school educations, and they haven't heard of these places. I mean, it's not their fault they haven't heard about these places, but I thought, well, maybe I could write a book that would shed some light on what these death camps were like. And it took me, here it is, the Commandant of Lubezec. It took me, I would say, about 2 years to write into research, and I went to Poland on a number of research trips, and the book came out, and I kind of thought, oh, good, well, I got that out of my system, and I didn't see myself necessarily writing about the Holocaust again. But what I didn't anticipate is that the book would be as maybe successful as it turned out to be. And now I talk about the Holocaust a lot, and I'm just aware that that's what my career is going to be. It's going to be discussing what happened in Europe between 1933 and 1945, because I've got all this stuff in my head. And I feel a responsibility to sort of talk about what happened and what hatred can bring to a society if it's not checked. And then my second novel, it came out just in October, and it's In the Shadow of Dora, and it's about the real life intersections between the Holocaust and the Apollo program, because I'm a space nerd. I love the space race, and it was a lot of fun to get grants to go to these places that I would want to go to in my spare time anyway, like the Kennedy Space Center, the Johnson Space Center in Houston, the Marshall Space Flight Center. And the books come out, and I've really enjoyed chatting with people about these two events of the 20th century and how they're still affecting us today. So that's like a very brief thumbnail sort of sketch about all the fiction I've been doing over the last really about 20 or 25 years.
Right. Now, you did have a one book called The Collector of Names. Now, that was like a collection of short stories, and they were all fiction, I believe, right?
That's correct, yes. And I've got a copy around here somewhere. We can do some show and tell. So yeah, that's it there.
Yeah,
And that was a huge achievement for me to get my my short story collection published, because short story collections are notoriously hard to get published. But all of the stories that I'd mentioned earlier about how I'd set these sort of writer tasks for myself and try to write from different perspectives, and that's what these that collection is all about.
So let's turn now to the kind of the point of fiction. And I have to say, for a long time, as a journalist, a writer, and I would say a wordsmith, fiction was on the bottom of my list. I always felt like fiction was fake. It always seemed like, well, I know people who have a lot more interesting lives than any of the fiction and their stories are actually true. Why would I read that? But I have to say, I've come around. I've come around to appreciate fiction. But I'll let you start off by telling us, from your vantage point, what is the value of fiction?
I love this question because it's a really rich one. But we're creatures that love to tell stories. It's in our DNA. And stories are so much a part of our lives that we tend to not think about them as being as essential as oxygen or water. I mean, when you come home from work, your partner or spouse would say, "Well, how was the day?" And that's an invitation to tell a story. On Sunday, we put on football games to watch football games or baseball games, and we don't think of sports as a type of story, but they
Yes.
are. You got heroes and villains, and is the team going to win? And it's a cliffhanger. Um, so we love to tell stories to each other, and we're such social creatures. And sometimes those stories are true, and sometimes they're not true. Sometimes they are true stories that have been burnished and embellished. And sometimes we keep telling stories to ourselves that maybe were never true to begin with, but we like to think that they happened. So I see stories as not just a form of entertainment. That's certainly a part of storytelling, but I think that to just say stories are entertainment is to maybe not take them as seriously as we should. And for me, the real value of telling stories, be they fictional or non-fictional, is that it allows us to get into the brain of someone else and to see the world through their eyeballs. And there are studies that show that the more fiction that you read, the more empathetic you are, the more you're probably going to be interested in questions of social parity and justice. And I don't see that as accidental because, and I'll wrap up answering this question, but it's such a good one. Uh, Reading fiction allows us to enter a moral maze and a moral playground, and to ask questions of how we would respond to situations that don't exist, but they exist in our head. So we follow the character around, and the character is about to make a decision, and we might be thinking, well, what would I do in this situation? And then we can measure up what we would choose as opposed to what the character would choose. So I see it as like an exercise in empathy, but also morality and entertainment for sure. And it's all sort of wrapped up. And that's one of the things that I love about writing fiction is when, and this just happened a couple of days ago, a student reached out to me because of a short story I'd written, and they didn't believe that it was fiction. It's based on an airline crash in Duluth. It's called 57 Gatwick, and it's the first story in the Collector of Names. And she had said, "Is this based on something? This seems so real." And that made me smile because that means I did my job right, because I made all of these fake things seem real.
Mm, mm. One of the things that I've found is that uh, as a person who's really a nonfiction writer, I like to write like science stuff, because I have a set of demonstrable quote facts, But one of the things I've been forced to recognize is that people don't get facts. Many people, they don't get facts, especially if you outline them. You have to create a narrative. It's like you have to create a framework, and it has to go from point A to point B, and you have to make connections with people. Now, that said, after you make the connections in fiction, they all go on, I think you were saying, to make their own connections. That's one of the other things that kind of irritated me about the readers of fiction, is that here somebody constructs a story, but then what you want out of the story is to just have some fodder to make your own story. And it's like, well,
Mm.
why don't you just make your own story? But I have to face it. A lot of people apparently have a hard time doing that.
Yeah, and I'm struck by the fact that because I lived in Europe for a long time, I wrapped my arms around the countries that I've had the good fortune to live in. And when I was living in Ireland and in England, people just read more over there. The bookstores have just, there's bookstores everywhere. People are reading on the tube, they're reading on the bus. I got on a bus in Dublin, and the bus drivers just started quoting W.B. Yeats, and I thought, oh, this would never happen in America. It's just this love of words. And in America, and it pains me to realize this, but if you are a male in America, uh, it it works out that maybe you'll read one book a year. Most
Oh,
readers in America are college educated women over the age of 30. And the publishing industry knows this. And most of the books that are published are nonfiction, because those tend to sell a little better in America. So I'm not sure what to make of all of this, that all of these things that I'm sort of observing about my country. But I really believe in my core that the lack of empathy that we have for each other as a nation, which has been exacerbated in the last 5 years for sure. I often wonder, is where would we be if we read more fiction, and if we read stories that involved lives that are other lives than what we know? And I'm not sure I'm making an awful lot of sense there, but I see a direct link to how the humanities are not valued in this country, and the dire state of affairs that we find ourselves in, where we've stopped trusting each other as fellow citizens.
Yeah, I think it requires a certain kind of support, a cultural support for that kind of thing, and a cultural appreciation. I will say, by the way, that I noticed in San Francisco that bus drivers do read. Uh, actually, and I say that because actually a lot of them, some of them are even have been college professors, but they made more money as bus drivers than college professors, so they quit, and they had their own time to do what they wanted to do, so they quit. So and I knew some of them, so I know that to be the case. But that said, there is it doesn't seem that there is a strong cultural support for reading in general. I mean, it's not like we say, "Oh, don't read," but people do get kind of poo-pooed for, reading a lot, or bookworm, or some kind of word like that we'll use to state our disapproval. But we don't really see, let's say, a lot of support, as much as you would think was warranted. How? But let's get to our subject about fiction.
And lying, yes.
Yeah, lying. And okay, so fiction really is telling a story that often is, fabricated from whole cloth in the imagination, but the kind of thing you're talking about, or the kind of books you have been focused on, they are taking the threads of fact or true things, taking the thread apart from the cloth and reweaving them into another cloth. Would that be accurate to say?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, especially what I write, which is Holocaust based. So I'm aware that I'm writing fiction, and I know this is called fiction and lying. I don't inherently believe that fiction is a lie. A lie is when you intentionally deceive someone. No one picks up a novel with the expectation that it's real. You realize that it's a story that's been concocted out of imagination. But long before I really started to write my first novel, The Commandant of Lubezek, I realized that although I will be writing fiction, and although I will be making up things when it comes to the lives of people that lived during the Nazi era in Europe, I made a promise with myself that I would get the facts right. So I know that sounds kind of strange, but I promised myself that although I am writing fiction, I will get the facts correct. Meaning, when I'm writing about what happens in a concentration camp, the facts are correct. What happened is historically accurate. It's just that I've populated maybe the camp with people that didn't exist, and then they become this aggregate, and it allows me to put the reader into the shoes of these characters in ways that I just couldn't if I was writing nonfiction or history, because then I would have to care about getting the mental process correct of people that were actually there. So it's a fine line that I walk, but I work very hard. I've made a promise to myself that anything that I publish that's about the Holocaust, I get the facts correct. And I do an awful lot of research to make sure that I'm on the right side of history there.
So getting to the lying part of it, these days, especially in journalism, which is, you know, core of kind of where you're at, there
Yeah, yeah.
is, you know, there is a whole thing about not being able to discern what is really true. How do you deal with that, you know, in the media, vis-a-vis your students? I'm sure this subject will come up and is delved into. How do you deal with um, a writer being able to tell a truth in such a way that a person who doesn't really want to believe that thing can at least give it a chance? How does how do you deal with that?
Yeah. Um, and I guess uh, you can see that I'm hesitating here because, you know, I work with 18 to 22 year olds mostly. Um, and I'm aware that, you know, we've got the media biases in our country. And I mean, this is nothing new. I mean, I studied Northern Ireland. I got my PhD in Northern Ireland, and that was an incredible education for me at a young age because you can take the same historical events, not change any of the facts, but just change the perspective from where you are standing on that historical event. And suddenly the heroes over here are actually the villains for these people over here. So from a young age, I realized, I mean, this seems like a new thing in the United States, but in studying the troubles in Northern Ireland, I mean, you get, say, Irish newspapers are going to report on things a little bit differently than British newspapers.
Mhm.
So that was a good education for me. So when it comes to talking to my students and talking about fiction, I encourage them to think about not just the perspective that the media or the presenter is coming from, but to ask questions of themselves, like, you know, where am I standing in relation to this? And what is maybe preventing me from seeing the world a little differently?
Mhm. Now,
I
as,
use this example of this word called parallax, which is an astronomical word.
sure.
And see, you know it, yeah. So parallax is the moon will look different depending on where you stand on the planet. So
Mhm.
what I do is I always draw the crescent moon the way that you'd see it in North Africa or something like that. And I said, you know, that's how the moon looks in Tunisia and in Egypt.
Mhm.
And that upside down moon looks weird to us if we're living in the Midwest, but you know, it's no different than it's the same object. It's just it looks different because you're standing in relation to it a little bit differently. And I can kind of see the students, you know, that helps them, I think, when it comes to, you know, more challenging intellectual positions, maybe.
The parallax example I like to use is hold your finger about 6 inches in front of about, you know, in the middle of two eyes, and then just sort of close and open alternatively each eye. And
Yeah, yeah,
it's the same finger, but you can see that the finger keeps changing depending on which
yeah.
eye. So,
That's
you know, so if it can happen in one head that you can see two different opinions, two different points of view, multiply that by all the people who are looking at it. You know?
yeah. Well, that's good. That's I might actually swipe that the next time that I teach my students.
Yeah. Well, I've been putting it out there, so take it. That's the whole point. um, so, given that, um, one, how do you propose that people can, um, let's say, write truth or tell a truth? Because maybe other people aren't writers, but as you said, we're all telling stories all the time. That's what we do.
Yeah.
So, how does one go about telling a truth, especially when it's a controversial truth, meaning that
Mm.
not controversy in as much as debating the fact or the thing, um, but in terms of people, it hurts them to believe that thing. They may feel diminished if they accept that truth. It can feel like diminishing themselves. For example, how do we how do you approach telling that kind of truth?
Um, I get wow. So I love this. So this is a good meaty question because I'm thinking both as a writer
Mm,
and as a professor. You know,
mm,
so I would approach it differently, I suppose, if I'm teaching writing, if I'm getting students to think about their fiction or their nonfiction with honesty. so I would approach that differently than I would if I was teaching, say, a novel that was, from, I don't know, we were just, talking about the novel in general, and what does truth look like for this particular author. So I would maybe go about that differently, because in the one hand, you've got the writer, and that's an internal truth that they're trying to get on the page.
Mm.
And they may or may not be able to get it on the page. Maybe it's too painful, or, and they want to sort of skirt around it. And then even how you remember things, our memories, we like to think are, very accurate, and they're not. They change over time. But if we're looking at, say, novels, and I'm teaching those, then I'm more interested in asking my students, well, what do you think the writer wants us to consider here?
Mm.
And I don't feel like I've done a very elegant job answering this question,
Mm.
but that's because I guess it depends on where I'm standing in relation to my students and what subject I'm teaching.
Yes, and I think it is one of those kind of questions, as you say, meaty, and I think it's worthwhile for each of us to consider that question, even if we don't have an answer for it, because then it starts to open up the complication between what is written or what is said and what is heard or read. So
Yeah.
because the communication finally is not a one-way thing, it's a two-way thing. It's not just what I say, but what is heard when I say it. That's they were always within that constraint. Uh,
Mm.
one thing I want to say to our participants is, please be thinking of questions or comments, because momentarily we'll be turning to you to get your participation in this discussion. Um, but how would you educate a listener or a reader to discern what one should make an endeavor to believe?
Mm. I'm struck, and I was talking about this last night. I see Nancy is here, and she was in the group that I talked to last night about my latest novel, In the Shadow of Dora, and about the real life connections between the Holocaust and the Apollo program. And I'm not at all surprised that there are some people that believe those two events were hoaxes, that they didn't happen. Because on the one hand, you've got the Holocaust, where it's so monstrous, and it must be more comforting to believe that we're not capable of doing that to each other. But of course we are, and that's why we must study it. And then on the other hand, you've got Apollo, which is just this mind-blowing bravery and ingenuity, and how we all came together. I'm saying we as a nation, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of scientists came together to create the machinery to get, boot prints on the moon. And that is a dazzling display of what we're capable of doing when we work together. So I'm not surprised that these two events are listed by some as hoaxes, and that they didn't happen. And the people that do believe that these are hoaxes go to extraordinary lengths to continue that belief in their head. They're no different in my mind than people that believe in a flat Earth. I mean, you never hear of a flat Mars society, but we've got a flat Earth society, apparently. You know, you can look at Jupiter and the moons are going around Jupiter, and I'm like, it makes no sense to me. But they go to these elaborate sort of lengths to believe that all airline pilots are in on the conspiracy and all these other things. So I think that there are some people out there, and this is certainly the case with our current political climate with QAnon, that have really allowed themselves to be suckered in by these elaborate lies, and then they go to even more extraordinary lengths to justify those disbeliefs, and then that becomes the reality, which is just very strange to me.
Well, it's I think people have a need to believe something,
Yeah,
and that
yeah.
that need to believe is an emotion, has an emotional base, and then there's a cognitive reality that we sometimes strike up against, and unfortunately we have a greater emotional need than we do cognitive need, I think. So You know,
Yeah.
it's a battle between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. Bet on the amygdala. You know,
Yeah.
because that.
Yeah. And we're creatures that really yearn for community, and you know, these conspiracy theory groups, that's a type of community,
Mhm,
like-minded people that, in my estimation, believe the most outlandish and potentially harmful ideas.
mhm. But isn't that part of kind of like an exceptionalism kind of thing too? It's like if I can, in order to have my group, I have to figure out, well, what defines me is different from the other people. Well, I
I
must be special because we know the real thing. We know the earth really is flat.
Oh, Lawrence, I think you are absolutely correct. I think that's maybe the allure of some of these conspiracy theories, because it allows people to feel like they're smarter than the average person. I mean, everyone wants to feel that way, but you're in on secret information. Um,
And we're part
so
of the in group, you know.
yeah, yeah, everyone wants to be in on the in group. So
Exactly. Okay. Well, I want to open it up to our other participants. Do
yeah,
any of you have questions? Because I have lots of them, as you probably have experienced by now. Um, Anyone else have questions, comments?
I'm going to ask a question. Patrick, hi.
yeah. Hello again.
Uh, are your what are your thoughts about what storytelling, the kind of storytelling that you value, can do against what's been happening in America the last several years? I'm struck by what Mitt Romney said. I think it was the night of the storming of the Capitol. He's been a kind of a singular voice on that side of the equation. He said, what we have to do, he was speaking of elected officials, is start telling the truth.
Yeah.
Which seems, you know, an overly obvious thing to state, but we've gone so far away from truth telling. Is the kind of storytelling that you do and hope for, can we come away from where we are now through storytelling?
I hope so. And if
we being America, I mean, you know, almost everything has been discredited now, I think. And so almost everything can be believed in a wrong way. What's the
yeah,
role of the writer in regard to all this? And what are your hopes for us in regard to the kind of storytelling that I think Romney was talking about?
I hope, and you know, maybe I'm being naive here, but I hope that there's maybe a recalibration for the importance of truth. Um, you know, a previous president told 30,000 lies in public. God knows how many lies he told behind closed doors to cabinets, and I mean, it must be much higher than 30,000. But the Washington Post was keeping track. So I mean, the truth was under assault of the last 4 years. And I'm hopeful that maybe, this is maybe me being naive, maybe the country is fatigued by that, and would want to just, you know basic things that when someone tells you something, especially a politician, that it, maybe there's more trust that they've got, you know, good science, for example. You know, we've had plenty of people saying that climate change isn't real, which is bogus, of course. You know, something like 95, 96% of scientists, you know that it's happening, but yet a number of people have been led to believe that it's junk. And I mean, that's just one example. So I don't have an answer. I don't think anyone necessarily has an answer here, because everything is more fractured, which brings greater intellectual freedom because you've got all these different news sources that you can turn to. But at the same time, we don't have a singular Walter Concrete that says, you know, and that's the way it is, you know, in the 1960s, where, you know, we have a unified understanding the news, and even the news itself, we can turn to different flavors of the news. And I don't have an easy answer, but I'm hopeful that at least with fiction, readers can invest themselves in a world that feels real and feels truthful. Because even with an unreliable narrator, you get towards the end of the narrative and you know that they're an unreliable narrator, and maybe you're seeing the story in a new way. And so I think fiction is inherently a truthful vehicle. And I can't help but think of Tim O'Brien's wonderful phrase, story truth versus happening truth. And sometimes story truth is truer sometimes than happening truth. That's a line from The Things They Carried. And that is fiction. Most of the things that happened in that book didn't happen. And yet it's held up as one of the premier examples of the American experience in the Vietnam War. And we could say the same thing about The Red Badge of Courage, or All Quiet on the Western Front. These are examples of war literature, fiction, but yet they feel real to us. And these untruthful accounts become, in some ways, more real and visceral than history itself.
I think that happens a lot as an extension with movies. You know, even when movies are based on a historical book, you know, the way that people move and the way they, you know, smile or don't smile or look or, you know, or walk or something, those things are all fiction. But they serve to bring the historical narrative to life in a memorable way. And so for many people who consume that, that is the history. You know, they don't separate that look that, you know, George Washington gave Jefferson or somebody, you know, from the reality, because that is a communication. You know, the way you look or the way you stand, you pause, all that's a communication, and it influences how you hear the actual historical data, you know. So that's where I have a hard time trying to resolve how do we get a close to accurate picture of historical facts, you know. Partly because of how the consumer needs to consume it, otherwise they don't get anything out of it.
Yeah, I know that when shortly before Steven Spielberg started filming Schindler's List, I know that there were a number of Holocaust scholars that were a little worried that the same guy that did Jaws and Raiders of the Lost Ark and Close Encounters of the Third Kind was going to take on the Holocaust. Because, and I understand this, they knew that whatever he produced, that would be how people would come to see the Holocaust in general. Now, I have problems with Schindler's List, but by and large, you know, the way that he presented that on film is truthful. And we know that, you know, we know that we're not actually seeing the events as they're unfolding. But I guess that's part of being human nature. I mean, short of building a time machine and going back to, I don't know, the American Civil War, we can only but approach that through the imperfections of history and art.
Mm-hmm. Of course, however we would go back, that would also be an imperfection. You know, so.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it would just be that one perspective. So maybe we're stuck with, we're recreate whatever someone tells us, we're recreating that thing in our head, much the same as we eat a steak and we can't get it until we break it down into amino acids and reconstruct it in our own protein. You know, so maybe it's that kind of thing, you know. Thea had an interesting question about, everyone can see it in the chat, so I don't need to read it.
Oh, you know, I'll read it just in case people on Facebook.
Okay. Oh, that's right. I forget about them.
So I read that children who are good liars often grow up to be very intelligent and creative. Were you a good liar when you were a child? Do you think that affected your creativity, or should we not call a child a liar and just call them imaginative? I love that. Part of me would want to say you should ask my mom if I was I did have an imaginary friend, and I guess that's an indicator of a kid that's got a good, well, imagination. I don't, I'm not sure I want to say I was a good liar, but I was aware of perception, if that makes sense. And I knew that I was pretty good at constructing story at a young age. Back when I was a teenager, I was involved in something that I just I didn't tell a lot of people about. I was really into Dungeons and Dragons, huge into Dungeons and Dragons, which in the 80s was like, you know, Satan worship and stuff like that. But it's just a role-playing game, and it taught me these really valuable lessons about storytelling. And I didn't realize it at the time, but you know, you're constructing this world, and then you have other players that are involved uh, in in this thing that you've created in your head. And I would argue that writers of my generation, Generation X, I think it could be really interesting to see how many of us are professional writers, especially fiction writers, and how many of us played Dungeons and Dragons when we were teenagers. And I bet that there are a lot of fiction writers of my generation that did just that because we were learning how to tell story.
Mm, mm. Yes, very interesting. Uh, Other ways that people might be better prepared to tell their own story uh, in a believable way. How would you, any suggestions you can give people? Because we're always telling stories, as you mentioned before. We're always true or untrue or partially true. Uh, we're always telling stories to communicate. Can you give us any kind of tips as to some elements that go into good storytelling?
I think what makes a story really good for me, at least, is one, it's believable and I'm immersed in it fully. If I'm reading something, I mean, good writing is an act of hypnosis. And I've said this before, but you know, it's just so true. If a writer has done her or his job properly, I forget that I'm reading and I'm transported somewhere else. It's mind control, it's hypnosis. And if that can happen, that's a good sign that I'm really carried away by the story itself. But I think one of the things that all writers need to think about is, well, once someone finishes my story, there's the so what question. All right, so I finished this book, I finished this short story. I mean, so what? So there has to be, I call it subtext. There has to be this thing that's more than just telling you a story. I really want the reader to go away, you know, thinking about something that might change their way of looking at the world with themselves in some kind of way. So I think if you're the writer that's going to sit down and write fiction or nonfiction, you have to figure out, well, you have to answer that so what question. And I think that it's really important for you to sort of understand where you're coming from and what it is that you want people to think about. And this is not something I talk about very often, not because it's a secret, it's just it doesn't come up very often. But when I'm working on a novel, before I write even the title on the manuscript, I have something at the top that I call it the needs. You know, what are the needs of this particular novel? And I have a list of like 5 things, usually 5 things that this is what I want the reader to come away thinking. And I do that because as soon as the Word file opens up, that's the first thing I see when it opens up, and it's a reminder to me that everything you're doing is to answer those questions. And that's what works for me, I think. But I think other writers probably have a similar sort of thing, you know, in their imagination. You know, they imagine an audience or something like that.
Mm-hmm. An underlying question is, how important is truth, finally, and why, if it is?
Yeah, it's we like to think of truth as being objective, but it's really very subjective. And you know, is truth ultimately just something that's consensual? You get enough people to believe it. Um, that's the truth. And I know science factors into this. You know, water boils at a particular temperature. You know, the Earth spins at a particular speed. But those two are types of truths that we've agreed upon, but they happen to be the truths of science and mathematics. Um, Yeah, I'm aware that, for, we have words to communicate with each other, but really at the end of the day, we're also stuck in our skulls, and we're working really hard to invite each other into our mind space. And we have to use words for that, or maybe music or images, but those are imperfect things. So that might mean that the truth in a is unknowable. Yeah.
Mm, mm.
And we started talking about the Holocaust, and this is nothing new, of course, but during the Third Reich, I mean, the truth was that Jews were inferior, and they should be sent to concentration camps, and that was the truth. And it was more than the truth; it was the law.
Mm.
And so the truth changes. I mean, we know this. We just need to look at our own painful history in the United States about what was once held as like just natural ideas, and now they're kind of repulsive. You think of attitude towards Native Americans, slavery, for example. Yeah.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I noticed that people are changing the story of slavery now to they were like coming to get a better life, looking for better economic opportunity,
Yeah.
which is like, huh?
Yeah.
So, but I think one of the things that I've come across is this idea about mutually verifiable data. The idea that the things that we can mutually verify, we will call that facts. And if you can show that that thing is not true uh, mutually, then we can say, okay, well, we'll take that off the facts list. But in order to do anything together, we have to create a mutually verifiable reality. Now, there may be
Hmm.
another reality out there that neither of us have discovered, but if we're going to do anything together, if we're going to dance together, we have to be listening to the same music, you know,
Yeah.
and have
Yeah.
a sense of like how this dance goes. Otherwise, we just dance by ourselves, but that's not the same thing as putting a person on the moon. You got to have some coordinated, accepted. If all those people have different ideas about gravity, you won't have anybody landing on the moon, you know.
Yeah. That's right. That's
you
right.
know
Yeah.
so, and if they all have their own mathematical system and their own theories of relativity, you will not put a man on the moon or anybody else, or a monkey.
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
so yeah, so I think that
Yeah. It's
go ahead.
It goes back to being a part of communities and agreed upon things. Here I am at Augustana University, and I have colleagues that I'll disagree with on certain pedagogical things or initiatives that we want to start. But everyone that teaches at this institution, there are 5 core values at Augustana, and we all agree that those 5 things are the guiding principles of how we're going to educate the next generation of the next generation for South Dakota and beyond. So I think that that's good, to have some sort of touchstone. And at least in the United States, I mean, we can disagree about an awful lot of things, but as long as we can agree on the Constitution and how the Constitution is a living document that has amendments to it, I think ultimately I'd like to think that we'll be okay, because that's the one thing that we all agree on. Because I'm struck by the fact that I come from a nation, and I really love this about America. We are a nation of immigrants, and we come from different places. But our understanding of what it means to be American is rooted in a civic understanding of being American. Whereas if, say, you come from, I don't know, maybe Norway or Japan, that's a little more homogenous, and then it becomes a little more cultural. But if I see those as sort of the 2 ways you can structure a contemporary country. And as long as we have that sort of civic understanding and that touchstone of the Constitution, maybe I'm hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
That's such an American thing to be, though, hopeful about the future.
So, anybody else have questions, comments?
I have one more. I've been thinking the last couple of days quite a bit about the suppression of story. I read a feature story in a national magazine lately. I think it was the Smithsonian, about the massacre of African Americans in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. And I lived in Oklahoma in the 70s, getting a graduate degree. Nobody ever said anything to me about that. And even today, Oklahomans, including Tulsans, and I spent quite a bit of time in Tulsa, are saying this is news to them, that they didn't know the story. In 1921, some 300 plus African Americans living in a part of Tulsa called the Black Wall Street, a prosperous, thriving community, were massacred by white Oklahomans, to include the use of air power. They were bombing them and strafing neighborhoods and burned everything to the ground. And it's just now coming to light. That to me is astonishing. How could that story be so successfully suppressed for all those years? 100 years of suppression of that story, so that even African Americans who are descendants of those who experienced it,
they didn't know,
don't know the story. What? You've been following some of that, I'm sure, Patrick. What are we to make of that?
Yeah, well, like you, Charles, I heard about that for the very first time in my life, maybe 2 years ago. And my reaction was, how on earth did I not know about this? Because I like to think I'm a fairly educated guy, and I'd never heard about this part of my history. I wasn't surprised that it happened, sadly, but I was surprised that I hadn't heard of it. And I suspect there are an awful lot of moments like that in history. What gets held up and remembered, and what is suppressed. And maybe it's
how a story of that magnitude could be so successfully suppressed for so long that even native Oklahomans don't know the story. That seems to me to be beyond any other suppressions that I know of. I mean, growing up as a South Dakotan, what happened at Wounded Knee was sort of known. I mean, it's much better known now, but that narrative wasn't ever completely suppressed. The one in Oklahoma was for 100 years. I'm just astonished at this. I'm still trying to process it.
You bring up a really interesting point, Charles, and that is that we can lie by not telling the truth, by suppressing the truth, is because it gets down to deception, intentional deception. And when you have intentional deception, whether you do it with a nod or, a sleight of hand or a wave of the hand or just silence, it's still a lie,
Yeah, and I know that we've got these other unwritten chapters in our history that hopefully will come to light and get the sort of narrative that they deserve.
Well, I think that there's an effort in the state government to rewrite our history now. I think we're putting in $900 million to make ourselves feel better about American history. Good luck with that narrative.
Yeah, and I wonder about the impetus of that. Why should we feel better about our history? I mean, but I'm also, someone that wants to know the reality of what happened in the past, so that maybe we can learn from it and change. But that yearning to be comforted by American history, I think that's dangerous.
It's very dangerous. It's very dangerous. It's not only dangerous for our kids, who will be isolated in terms of their perception of where we are in the world, but our country in terms of how people see us, and how we see ourselves. A quick story about that. It's very common in the Japanese actually send their kids on these field trips, often send the whole class to countries overseas. And one of the things that's very interesting in Japan is when those kids go to see the museums in Thailand that talk about the atrocities of the Japanese. And they have never heard that before. It's kind of like this kind of story. They have never heard those stories before. And they see for the first time a museum dedicated to the atrocities that the Japanese military committed on behalf of the Japanese people, or actually the emperor. And those people are weeping,
Yeah.
they're devastated. And it's not just the kids. When tourists go over there, these people they're devastated because they never heard that in their schools. And so I think it's a cautionary tale for us that we have, and to see how for everybody else knows. Only you, it's kind of like that, the story of like somebody goes to the bathroom and then they, their skirt is tucked in their panties and they're walking around, but nobody says anything. It's like, do you say something or just let them go? It's like, hey, I didn't see nothing, or do you say, hey, sister, I think you might want to check that out,
Yeah.
So some people, they don't want to talk about it, they just want to just let people, let this, or they feel better, Unfortunately, we've come kind of like to the end of our hour. It's been just really a pleasure, and I look forward to continuing this conversation because I think it's one that has a lot of merit, and it has a lot of other facets that we just don't have time to cover here today.
Yeah.
Was there
Thanks for having me on, Lawrence.
Yeah, it was a pleasure having you, and yeah, it was all good. Anybody else?
Thank you all for joining us.
Yes. And there were a few more. Thank you all. And I'll thank you all the people on Facebook and Party On. Okay, we'll see you all next week. Tunisia will be, Tunisia Islam. She's an attorney in Sioux Falls, and she and one of her co-conspirators will be joining us next week. And that's going to be an interesting discussion too. We'll learn a lot of interesting things about immigration and that kind of stuff. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next week, same time at the same station.
Oh, this is.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I put a question on the chat. I didn't realize the time had gone by so quickly.
I know.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.